Overall survival is sort of our gold standard. It always has been, because all the other things we'd like to impact for patients, making them feel better, making them able to continue to enjoy doing their regular activities like working or spending time with their family, they only matter if the patient's alive to experience those. And so survival matters to every patient, and it matters to every clinician. It's also a valuable endpoint because it's both a composite safety and efficacy endpoint. So it really says, does this drug work well enough to help keep people alive in the face of a progressive disease that will ultimately be fatal? And is this drug safe enough that even though it's causing adverse events, that's not compromising the survival of the patients on study? Because many of the drugs we use to treat cancer are very toxic. So it's a powerful endpoint in that regard, that it captures both the bottom line of safety and the bottom line of efficacy. The problem is that, and this is actually not a problem, this is a great problem to have, many of the diseases we treat have more and more therapeutic options, which means patients are living longer. They're now living for years, and it starts becoming impractical to do clinical trials that are going to take years and years of follow-up to get the answer, that may require enrolling thousands of patients in some cases to even see enough deaths occurring on the trial to see if there's a difference between the old standard therapy and the new treatment that we're proposing as a new standard of care. And the other thing is that when we look at overall survival, that can be confounded, which means it can be impacted by the subsequent therapies that patients receive after being in the clinical trial. So we're giving them an intervention in the setting of the clinical trial, but then once they go off of the clinical trial, say because their cancer has progressed on a scan, they're going to get another treatment that perhaps increases their overall survival, and then suddenly we've got that noise introduced, which is called confounding in statistical terms, that makes the overall survival endpoint harder to interpret. The other thing about overall survival is, in order to interpret it, it really needs to be studied in a randomized trial. So there are a number of things that could help a patient live longer. A patient might live longer because a new treatment really is beneficial, but a patient also might live longer just because she has biology of her tumor that's favorable, irrespective of anything we're going to do for her in terms of medications we're going to administer. So if you try to look at overall survival in a single-arm trial, it becomes impossible to sort out in many cases whether or not patients living longer is an effect of what we're doing in the clinical trial, the drug we're administering, the radiation we're giving, whatever the intervention might happen to be, or if that patient's just living longer because of good biology. So as we've had more and more drugs developed that show really profound evidence of efficacy very early in development, even in phase 1, it may be difficult to do a randomized trial because we may truly not have an adequate control arm or comparator arm. This is particularly true in diseases that have few therapeutic options or no therapeutic options. It'd be really hard to find an adequate control arm to be able to do that randomized trial ethically. Dr. Pazzer alluded to this in his comments yesterday, but one of the premises of why a randomized trial is ethical to begin with is that there's equipoise, which means that as a clinician, you don't care, so to speak, which arm your patient is assigned to. If we're doing a clinical trial where all the clinicians are crossing their fingers that their patient is in arm B, we shouldn't be doing that randomized trial, because it means that we have enough prior evidence to suggest that arm B is going to outperform arm A, that it's really not ethical to be randomly assigning patients anymore. So since we can only interpret overall survival and other endpoints like it, things like progression-free survival or disease-free survival in a randomized trial, those are called time-to-event endpoints, you can really only interpret those in a randomized trial. So if you're in a situation with a disease or a line of therapy in a disease that you can't do a randomized trial, overall survival starts to become not the best endpoint anymore. Quality of life is undoubtedly important. Patients want to feel well, and we hear that over and over and over. They want to be alive, but they also want to be alive and able to do all the things that they love to do, and who wouldn't? So on the one hand, that has to be a focus of all of our drug development, but it can't be the only thing, because as much progress as we've made, the reality is, and we're reminded of this in every scientific conference, the reality is as much progress as we've made, even in diseases like melanoma, even in diseases like non-small cell lung cancer, which are unrecognizable to the disease they were 10 years ago, still, almost everybody is ultimately succumbing to their metastatic disease. So it's wonderful if we can make patients feel better, but it's not enough, because we're not yet at a point that we are curing people with metastatic disease. on occasion that's happening, but it's certainly not the majority of cases, and it's certainly not the majority of diseases, even where a lot of progress has been made. So it's a component of it, but it can't replace trying to do what we're ultimately trying to do, which is control this disease so that that patient lives a long life. Ultimately the goal would be, a long life that's equivalent to their age-matched peers, the same kind of progress that's been made in HIV and AIDS.